Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is a standalone video, a one-off if you like, and it was prompted by having a look at eBay, and I saw an old record player from the 1960s and it was going for an unbelievable amount of money. I mean, bearing in mind the particular record player would have cost about £12 or probably 12 guineas in its day, and allowing for inflation, I mean that's going to cost a bit more, but this particular one was for sale for £560. So you can convert that to your currency and see that it's an unbelievable amount of money for something that was basically junk when it was made and is still junk today. When you consider going back to the 60s, if you're old enough to do so, I'm sure you'll find these comments true to life. But in those days, virtually everybody had a record player for playing records. This word vinyl is something that's cropped up in the last 10 years or so. Fair enough, they were made of vinyl, but they were called records, and you went to the record shop. Anyway, I digress. What the point of this video is to have a look at the ingredients of these 1960 low-end record players and explain basically why they sounded so bad. Obviously, any entry-level product, even of today, is going to be junk. But saying that, in those days, and probably even still today, majority of people don't buy quality apparatus for playing music, whether it's, well, we'll exclude telephones because they are not devices for playing music, really. Yeah, we won't even go there. So let's get started and have a look at why these early low-cost record players sounded so bad. Let's make a start with the amplifier that many of these low-cost units used. Needless to say, they are all valves because transistors at that stage were available but were very expensive, and it didn't make sense to start transistor amplifiers, because although today valves are an extortionate price, mainly because they're not mass produced anymore, but in the 60s everything had valves in it by and large. Televisions, record players certainly, and valves were very cheap. I used to play with them as a kid and buy them with pocket money, so that gives you some idea how cheap they actually were. So it didn't make sense to make a valve, I should say a transistor amplifier, because even the lowest cost transistors were 3 or 4 times the price of some of the valves used. So let's get back to our valve amplifier. Now there's ways to make a valve amplifier cheap. One of them is to use valves like the UL84, and its claim to fame is that they would work on a relatively low voltage. The anode voltage would be typically 240 volts. Now that may sound like a high voltage, but when you consider the EL84, which would be designed for the more higher end of the low-priced amplifiers. This would work on typically 300, maybe a little bit more. And the main difference is the heaters were designed to work at a higher voltage. Now, one way that they kept the price of such amplifiers low is they wouldn't use a mains transformer. And it meant that the heaters were a higher voltage, and they typically got their heater voltage either from a high power resistor in series, which was terribly wasteful and produced a lot of heat, or, as in the case of this circuit, they actually used a tapping on the motor of the turntable, and the rectifier was a UY85. Its claim to fame, it was only half wave, whereas any decent amplifier, you'd have a mains transformer which would also isolate the mains. These had live chassis, and they stopped you getting a shock by having plastic knobs and plastic shafts on the, well, bear in mind there was only two controls, an on-off switch, which was usually linked to volume control, and another potentiometer, which was a simple top cut control. These circuits always had a low level residual hum in the background, and ironically that's how you knew that the amplifier had warmed up, because all of a sudden you get this low level hum in the background. Here you can see the simple tone control. It didn't offer any boost or any correction to the bass at all. More about this later. All it did was start chopping the high frequencies, and it kind of gave you the impression that it was giving you a little bit of bass, but of course it wasn't, because these amplifiers with just a single valve, the UL84, had quite low gain, so you inherently couldn't have any negative feedback, because that would reduce the gain even more, but it would make it sound better. But you needed all the gain you could get from the crystal cartridge. Because the gain of the single stage of amplification was so low, it meant you had to have a very high output cartridge, and obviously that would exclude a magnetic cartridge, which would typically give you about 3 millivolts. You needed a cartridge which would give you volts out, a minimum of 3 volts, and preferably a little more. To get that kind of voltage out of a crystal cartridge, it meant that the stylus had to be coupled to the crystal elements almost by a solid rigid pole. The effect of that was that there was no compliance in the cartridge. To get that kind of voltage out of a record, the stylus was very rigidly coupled, mono of course, very rigidly coupled to the actual element, which it basically twisted and moved, which produced the voltage, much like a piezoelectric crystal would do in other circuits even today. Because it had so low a compliance, it also meant to keep the stylus able to track the record, you had to have quite a high tracking weight, and it would be typically about 8 to 10 grams. The effect of that was it destroyed your records, because the stylus wouldn't follow the groove. it would try to cut a line straight through the middle, which it actually did in some cases. Certain records, particularly the more modern pop records of its generation, they would readily skip and jump in the grooves because it couldn't track particularly low end. A crystal cartridge, if you fed it into a high impedance, which of course a valve circuit would inherently be without any extra components, and you can see by the circuit, it goes straight into the volume control, which would be about 1 meg in, or maybe even 2.2 meg. So you didn't need any correction, which is just as well because the valve didn't have enough gain to do that anyway. I'm going to play you now a very small snatch of a Dave Clark 5 record which I owned in the day, and my crystal cartridge of its time. Yes, I had one of these awful things. Today it doesn't seem like a big deal to track this piece of music, but it used to make it jump. It's just the tiniest snatch because it's copyright material. YouTube will be quite upset if I play too much of it. Anyway, this is it, and it's from Dave Clark 5 called Glad All Over. When you compare that with some of today's bricked CD music or something like that, these cartridges they would just jump all over the record. And a trick that was used is you'd tape a coin to make it even heavier. So you can imagine what damage it did to records. It's scary stuff. This is a typical cartridge used in its day. It was a turnover type, when you turn a little knob on the front, and you could either play 78s, which once they were pretty well on their way out in those days, but many people still had a big collection, and all the record player turntables had 78 speed on them. But you did need a different stylus. Inherently, it just had a wider and larger point to the stylus, and you needed that to play 78 RPM records. But equally, you couldn't play 45s or LPs with that. It was just too big for the grooves. So you turned it over, and it usually said something like LP on it. Now, if you look at this cartridge, you can see that the stylus is coupled to the element with metal, and it's quite thick metal at that. So you can imagine that having to track the groove of the stylus. But as I said, you needed that rigidity in order to be able to bend and twist the crystal element to produce the high voltage that you needed to drive a single valve amplifier. That you could very easily change the stylus, because many of the early ones, again for cheapness, used a sapphire tip, which would have a relatively short life. As the years went on, you had a diamond tip, which would last a relatively long period of time. But many of the stylus itself were glued on, and in time the glue failed and the actual stylus itself dropped out and vanished. So to change it, as you can see from the picture, there's a screw at the end of it. You just release the screw and the stylus pulled out, and you went to your local record shop, and for a relatively small sum of money, usually less than £1, you could replace the stylus, and you were fit to go for another. Well, not many people wore the stylus out. Most people damaged them in some way. Very common to have the stylus actually bent like that. The metal piece that should be flat and straight would end up being like that. very common, seen it countless times. Strangely enough, most of these low-cost record players used an automatic turntable. In other words, you could stack up 8 and in some cases 10 discs and play them automatically. The problem that you would have is that the stylus and arm and cartridge tracking at 10 or possibly even more grams, particularly if it's got a coin on the top, would be so heavy that it would actually make the record slip on top of the other one. And many a time you'd end up playing just 1 or 2 records, because as it got near the top of the pile, the record would just slip, because there was so much weight on it that the record would just slip. Because when you think the first record that dropped down landed on a rubber mat and that held the record in place, but when you've got another record on top and it would actually tip the disc and it would just slip. Let's have a little waffle now about the sound of these players. Now, the output power was very low, and by and large UL84 was one of the common valves, but there were 1 or 2 others. But because you only use half-wave rectification, the voltage of the anode was relatively low, or the plate if you prefer, and they would typically give about 1.5 to 3 watts maximum, and that wouldn't be at a low distortion, that would be at 10%, because all these amplifiers, they didn't have any negative feedback, so you couldn't correct the frequency response or anything like that. It was just raw sound out of the cartridge, and it was pretty awful. They didn't go down very far in frequency. You wouldn't expect to get anything really below about 150 to 200 hertz on the low end, and because the cartridges were so bad, the upper end was about 6 or 7K. This all fed into a relatively small speaker, typically either a 5-inch round or a 7x4 speaker, and if you were really doing well, you might get an 8x5-inch speaker. Now, that in itself, obviously no tweeter, because there was no point, because the amplifiers didn't go up, and the typical frequency response of the amplifier would be like that, because normally feedback would lift those edges and you would have a bit of a flat response, but there was nothing like that. It was just U-shaped, and that's what it was. And bass would be a bad thing anyway, because the speaker was mounted on a bit of board on the front usually, and if you had too much bass, you'd actually get acoustic feedback, because the whole cabinet would vibrate and shake, and it would actually be picked up by the cartridge. And it was not uncommon to get acoustic feedback, particularly if you were playing it at near maximum volume, all 1.5 watts of it, because the cabinet would vibrate so much, because the speaker wasn't decoupled at all from the cabinet, and the cartridge itself, as you can see, it's very close to the speaker, and you would get acoustic feedback, and it would sort of go or noise. Imagine that modulated by the music, and it would be quite awful. And it would be worse if you closed the lid of the record player, because that would actually give you a degree of bass boost, but not deep bass. It would be 100, 150, and you get this terrible low frequency whining sound. So you then have to lift up the lid to stop it doing it in many cases. Great fun. Let's have a quick chat now about, if you like, the next stage up. What we've talked about so far is entry-level record players. But if we added a little bit of money to the equation, several things would change. And the first one is the amplifier. Now you would have a mains transformer where you could apply higher voltages, and of course it was safe because you could then earth the chassis and all the metalwork. Today this would be mandatory, but in those days, killed a few of the customers. No one really cared too much. It was their fault for touching it. So now we've got our higher voltage, and in many cases the rectifier valve was replaced by diodes, which made the efficiency, it didn't run so hot. We've still only got one valve, but this time it's a dual purpose valve. It has a triode and that would be, if you like, the preamplifier, and it had a pentode all in one envelope. There was a couple of valves that were very popular at the time. There's the ECL82, which is this circuit, and an ECL86, which was the next stage up. It was that little bit more power. That's really the only thing. But because we've now got a triode preamplifier in front of the pentode output valve, so to speak, we had gain to spare, and you'll notice this circuit actually has negative feedback. We didn't have any more power because the ECL82 would typically produce 2 watts, but the ECL86 would give you 3 watts. Now it doesn't sound like much of an improvement. In those days it was a typical power that you would get for such record players, and you would also, because you had all this extra gain, it meant that the cartridge could be of a better quality, and better quality means that it had compliance, and you could now track these more modern cartridges at 3 to 4 grams. I think that's where we're going to leave the video, other than to say, as time went on, you actually got some reasonably good sound from what was domestic. Well, it wasn't hi-fi, but you ended up getting some of the amplifiers were actually push-pull and would give you about 8 watts using a pair of these ECL82s or 86s. And if you really went posh, you would use EL84 in probably a 5-valve system, which was very close to hi-fi, but none of them ever used a mag cartridge. You did get some actually quite good ceramic cartridges, and one of them that comes to mind was made by a company called Sonotone, and it was a 9THHC, which was for a ceramic cartridge or crystal cartridge a very high compliance, but the penalty for that high compliance and low tracking weight, it would track at 2.5 grams, which was remarkably low in those days. But its output was only about 100 millivolts, and so you did need a good preamp or usually a valve like an EF86 or maybe a double triode like the ECC83, feeding a push-pull output, and that would be quite a good sounding product, bordering on the lower end of hi-fi. But hi-fi still remained in those days separates, but you'd have possibly at the low end of the market you'd use something like an SP25 Mark IV, which actually had a cast platter, I should say, and that formed the basis of low-end hi-fi. And then you'd have a separate amplifier and a pair of maybe Wharfdale Linton speakers, not the current one, but the original one. And many a person, that would be their first steps into hi-fi. But that's another subject. That's the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. Much appreciated.